I'm Eugene Sadler, a descendant of early Mormon pioneers. My great-grandfather, Abraham Coon, established the first settlement on the west side of Salt Lake Valley in the year 1853. Later, my grandfather married his daughter, Frances Ann. My parents are Leslie Dare Sadler, raised as Salt Lake City pioneer boy. My mother, Amelia Hardman, she was a farm girl on the west side of the Salt Lake Valley. They met by going to dances out at the Sadler Pavilion. And one night they were there in a large crowd and they had a prize waltz. And my father and mother ended up winning the prize waltz. So that is the means of them getting together, and their slimy little descendants have all come along since. I told you not to do that.
They're not slimy.
My father, as I said, was a city-raised boy. He grew up around the streets in Salt Lake City. He had a nice big dog he called Carlo. And he took up boxing when he was a young man, and he became quite a prominent boxer in this area.
The dog or the man?
Winning many bouts. Mom, that's enough. I wish it. And after meeting my mother, who was raised a farmer girl, she finally convinced my dad, a city boy, to become a farmer too. He moved into the area known then as Coonville, which was they made their move out here about the beginning of the opening of the copper industry. My father helped to build the power lines to bring power in to operate the mills. And then he did take up farming. They bought a farm, and most of my young life I spent on the farm, and I grew up to be a farmer type boy, and I just loved it. Later on, after my father passed away when I was 15 years old, I became somewhat the main support of our family. And with my mother, we established home for the rest of the family, and two older sisters soon were married and on their way. And I remained home until I was an old bachelor. I never dated girls till I was 26 years old. And I procured work my mother rather had a contract for custodial work at the schools here. I did the work, and we got along fine. We even bought a new car and a new home, thinking that we could move from the old farm downtown where it would be much more convenient for us. And the Depression came about that time, the Great Depression of the 30s, and we were stuck with an old farm on our hands. We couldn't sell it, and we couldn't get rent from people who lived there. And we had a new car that had been signed up for and a new home to pay for, and it was a little difficult for about 3 or 4 years, but we finally made it through in good shape. And shortly after that, I went to work in Salt Lake City for the Union Pacific Railroad, beginning as a student brakeman. I didn't care for the train work, but I went to labor then to have a steady job, and then I thought I'd better get back into train service. So I became a locomotive fireman for a short while there, and then I came back home to Magna, where I began work with Kennecott Copper. I was given a job as a first aid man and timekeeper to maintain their big dike during the summer months for a year, and then I was laid off when one mill was shut down. I had a serious operation for stomach ulcers, which had bothered me from the time I was 11 years old until it was now 1938 when I was 30 years old. And after that, I went back to work again for the Kennecott Copper, and with a few different jobs, shops and operating, and a warehouse clerk. I went back into the first aid work, and was only there a few weeks until I was asked to take up the X-ray program for them in their industrial hygiene program. There I spent most of my working years and had a happy time raising 12 children and providing for them a good home. We always had a good car. And the lady up the street, who was a newspaper reporter, Says, I watch the kids go by here every morning to school, and she says, none of them are dressed any better than yours, and few of them dress as well. One year, Dorene was sending 9 children off to school, including an Apache Indian student who had come to live with us for the year. But they finally all grew up. 5 of our boys went on missions, and they all married later, and then their mother and I were called to go on a mission to Samoa, where we spent a year there in Samoa, and then we were transferred to Wisconsin. We completed that mission in 1983, and we were home a few months and got a picture of all of our children dressed in their finery, one coming from out the Persian Gulf War, and one from Washington, D.C., and one from California, to be on hand for us for this wonderful family picture after 10 years absence. Now, we were only home a short while till Dorene and I were both called to the Jordan River Temple for an interview, and before we left, they had us set apart as ordnance workers, telling us 2 years was the minimum time that they'd like us to serve. So Dorene's health finally became so that she couldn't continue after a couple of years, but I've continued up to this present time, and that brings me to this very date that I'm speaking to you.
That's great. Grandpa, I want to know, how did your father die?
My father died from a deep-seated infection that was caused from dental work he'd had done. In the old days when this was done, back in the 20s, they never hardly knew what x-ray was, and the family dentist had discovered an ulcerated tooth. He extracted the tooth, and as they did in those days, they used gold, and they made a gold crown onto the next tooth to it, and then crowned the gap with a gold tooth also. And it was this one that the gold cap was anchored to that had the infection under it as well. And the old dentist used to just say, well, keep gargling it with salt water, it'll be all right. And it continued for over a year. My father would continually get drainage from it, and he finally decided he'd go to Salt Lake City to get more professional opinion about things. And they x-rayed it and found that his jawbone had been completely honeycombed above that tooth, meaning the infection had ate into this jawbone. And so he came home thinking about making plans. The doctor told him they had to go in there, clean that out, scrape it, and then it would heal up and he'd be all right. But it was only a matter of a day or two while he was still trying to plan when he could have time off from the company, where he was required to work a 12-hour shift and 7 days a week, that he wanted to line it up so that he could take time to go in and get that. In the meantime, he woke about midnight, just a day or two after the doctor had x-rayed him, and he was delirious with pain. They hustled him off to the hospital with the company ambulance we had here, and he lived 48 hours and passed away July the 16th, 1925.
Meningitis.
Wow.
He developed the meningitis.
Other than his boxing, what do you really remember him doing?
My father.
He was a hard worker on the farm, and
My father and I were close. My father was great. He was particular about how things were done, and I copied that pattern, I suppose, just naturally. And I helped my father on the farm. I used to drive the teams with the large loads of hay when I was only 9 years old, and it was quite a job to manipulate those things. And my father had me with him when he helped to move some of the larger buildings out of the old town of Ragtown, as they called it, located just below the Magna Mill at the foot of the hill there. I would push the blocks under the buildings as they jacked them up. As he and other men would jack them up, I helped get the blocks under till they'd get these large beams under, and then they'd move those buildings. And my father, being a boxer as he was always teaching me boxing, and the last Christmas present he bought for me before his death was a set of boxing gloves and a punching bag. And my father and I built a barn, or he built the barn, but the neighbor says, "Did you do that all alone, Sadler?" And he says, "Well, Jeannie and I did it." That was my father.
how many brothers and sisters were there?
I had 3 sisters and 4 brothers. My oldest brother, Grant, passed away he was injured fatally in an automobile accident coming home in the old horse-drawn school wagon from the old Hawthorne School, going up to Coonville, where we lived at the time. This is, we'd just moved down from Coonville. This was in April 1915 that my brother was hit with this car, and he was taken to my grandparents' home just a short ways further up the street where he was hit, and he lived about nearly 2 weeks. He lived about 13 days.
Do you remember that?
And he had developed the meningitis too. That's what the doctors were always fearful of, was the development of meningitis. And when he was, soon after he had passed away, the doctor says, well, if we had the medicine we have now, why, we could have cured him. So they had that kind of medicine when my father had meningitis, but it wasn't the kind of medicine that would cure him. So they told Mother the same thing. They said, well, if we had the medicine that we do 2 years later, we could have cured your father or your husband's illness too. And I was the 4th child in the family of 8. My sister Faye, then Brother Grant, then my sister Evelyn, and then myself, and then my sister Merle, and then my brother Wallace and LeGrand and Lavelle, in that order, the 8 children.
And then what about your mother? What are some memories you have of her?
Mother and I were very close. Maybe I can make this short. Do you want me to go into a little detail?
We would like to hear it short.
Okay. Well, like I say, my father passing away, the 2 sisters were older than I was. The one was working and planning on marriage. She was engaged to be married at the time. She stayed with Mother another 9 months and then married. That was Aunt Faye. And then Aunt Ev, she was still in school, but she got work at a grocery store and worked at the grocery store a bit. And I was home with Mother, taking care of the farm and finding odd jobs, and we lived quite easily. We had a few cows that I milked, and we took the milk to a dairy and sold that to help us along. And Mother,
Tell him that about dropping out of school. You didn't get to go to school.
Oh, yeah,
Mother used me as a consultant as she would a husband almost. So she conferred with me even though I was still in my teen years. Why, Mother consulted me about every move, and I know I cautioned her about certain moves that would have been a catastrophe if we'd have carried them through.
Yeah.
And soon after my father died, we had the new Model T car that he left us, and I would take Mother with her loneliness at evening times, occasionally when she'd ask me, out to the lake shore by Black Rock near sunset time. I remember we'd sit there for more than a half hour at a time without a word. She'd just sit there and ponder her thoughts, being alone. And so I was very close to my mother. And my younger brothers, as they grew up, and Mother was still leaning toward me for maybe a little counsel, a little advice. Why, she got say, well, we'll see the boy Gene. We'll ask the boy Gene about it. And my younger brothers got said, well, let's go ask the boy Gene about things. Just slurring this remark, toward me. Well, we better ask the boy Gene about it.
That's neat. So,
And my sisters and my brothers, they all have respect for me, maybe more than I deserve. But my 2 older sisters, they just adore me. And my younger brother, next in age to me, 4.5 years younger than me, he can forget me for long periods of time. I believe he just still looks on me as the older brother and take care of himself. And the younger brother, he's a father of 12 children, and that keeps him pretty busy, and he doesn't have much time for me anymore unless he wants some antique that I have that he'd like to restore.
And all of those brothers and sisters are still living, except for one,
The
Uncle
one that
LeGrand. No, Uncle LeGrand just died recently. Yes, Grant has been gone years and years now. So there's 2 actually. Yeah.
So Grant, actually, your grandson Grant was named after Grant?
I think so.
Well, that's interesting, or possibly maybe they have the same name. That's interesting. I never knew that. Huh.
No, Grandpa and Grant.
No, your Grant and our grandson Grant.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
How did your mother die? What did she die of?
Mother died, I guess, just kind of causes incident to age. She had had a fairly healthy life. She never knew what it was to go to a hospital till she was about 78 years of age. And Dr. Gallant, who I worked with, was called one morning when she was spitting up blood and having pain in her chest, and he came down and he says, well, Grandma, I got to send you to the hospital. She'd never been a patient in the hospital and she didn't want to go then. But he says, well, you'll have to if we take care of this situation. He says, you'll just have to go. She says, well, will you be my doctor? She says, I don't want to go unless you can be my doctor. And he says, oh, there are good doctors there, Grandma, and I'll be dropping in to see you. And then Grandma got well, came back here, and she lived with us 8 years, and Dorene and Mother got along just great. They got along better than two human beings that I ever knew.
Oh, that's
And but she finally couldn't be content, so they decided to, Aunt Phyllis and Doreen decided to take her to a care center. My brother had been bishop, and he says, you don't want to go to care centers. He says, every time I go there, he says, those dear old ladies grab me by the sleeve or by the tail of my coat and cry and say, get me out of here, will you? Get me out. But Mother wanted to go, and so that she insisted so much that Doreen and Aunt Phyllis, LeGrand's wife, took her to the Tooele Care Center where they had just built the new place, and it was just great out there. And Mother enjoyed herself and was much more content there than she'd been after living with us 8 years. She tried to live with the others for short periods of time, a month at a time. She'd go from one to the other. She couldn't stand that. So when she got out in Tooele, she says, well, this is great out here. She says, I sew for those dear old ladies that can't sew. I push those that can't get around I push them in their wheelchairs. And she says, I read to those who can't see to read. And she was just as happy as could be. And she was
says,
there.
I've been called on another mission, is what she said.
She'd filled one mission with teaching the Spanish people here, and she had many interested and converted to the church. And she says, this is just a second mission for me out here. And one cold winter, after she'd been there about a year, the fog was somewhat like it is around here today, and we'd been to Arizona and hadn't got out to see her. We'd gone Christmas vacation with the kids down there for about 10 days, and as we came back, we hurried out through the fog to see her, and she says, I have been sick, and her eyes look quite heavy, and she says, I have had the flu, she says, but I'm getting all right, and I'm going to be okay. And she says, don't bother to come out in this bad weather to see me. She says, I'm going to be just fine. About 2 days later, they called us early in the morning at 1:30 and said she'd passed away. And the way it was, they had their arrangement of rooms out there like the spokes of a wheel down different halls. And the hub of the wheel was where their desks were. And Mother would go down there and talk to those nurses. She'd stand at the counter and talk to them when she wasn't sleeping well. And they said that she came down and talked to us. There were 2 nurses sitting at this place about midnight at their office and making their records, and Mother was talking to them. And they said that 2 lights came on at the same time, so the 2 nurses had to leave at the same time to walk down to where the lights were, and one was right behind where Mother had started to walk away down an aisle, and this nurse was hurrying down to her light, and she was right behind Mother, and she says, as I went to go by her, she slumped, and she says, I think that's when she was gone. She says she just faded right out, and I took her right in my arms and eased her to the floor.
Wow.
It must have been massive, just
Yeah.
quick.
Well, that's good.
Her
She
biggest
was
wish,
okay.
that's
Yeah.
what she wanted.
Sure, that's neat.
Yeah.
What are some childhood stories you could tell us about Indians or just in the olden days?
Okay.
Grandma?
Well, I'll tell you, I could go a little further back to my own time, to my grandmother's time. Grandmother Hardman, I told you all. When she was a young bride, they moved up into Coons Canyon. And there were Indians in the area. Most generally, they had been shifted out into the deserts west of Tooele. But there happened to be Indians still lurking in the area here at times. And this one cold morning, when my grandfather Hardman went out to milk their cow up there where they had their location in the canyon, and he went out to the little barn to milk the cow, and as he stepped out of the door, he saw in the corner of the fireplace chimney, which was a big rock chimney outside of the building, he saw this Indian huddled with a cover over him by the rocks of the chimney, which would keep the rocks warm. And he saw that the Indian wasn't well. He could see that he was ill and weak, and so he took him into the house, and he knew that he wasn't in any condition to harm his wife, my grandma, so he asked her to fix him a little food, and he went on to milk the cow. And the story goes like this, that as grandmother was fixing the food, a mouse came out from behind the fireplace and started to cross the floor, and the old Indian pounced onto that mouse and ate it. He was so hungry. Indians used to eat rodents like that anyway as a part of their diet at times, you know. So after taking care of him, grandfather came in and fed him and got him on his way. The Indian left in the area, and grandfather a few years later moved out too. He wanted to get up where he had more farming land. So a lot of people were taking up ground up in what was called Huntsville. That's up Ogden Canyon, and near above where the Ogden Reservoir is there now. And a lot of them went up there. That's where David O. McKay's family was, and my grandfather's family became well acquainted with the McKay family. They were neighbors there in Huntsville. And one day grandfather Hardman had gone into the mountains to get some timbers. They were always getting timbers for one thing and another, to build fences or barns or buildings or for firewood. And he had gone up into the mountains and taken his oldest boy, George, with him, who was a young lad of about 8 or 10 years of age. And as they were chopping away at the wood, grandfather heard this war cry. The Indians would get on the warpath. There'd be a group of them get together, and they'd go raiding settlers' places, and sometimes they would kill the settlers, you know, and they'd make off with their stock or horses, whatever. And grandfather heard this war cry coming down the canyon above them. And he told his boy George, he says, "You go up there and hide in those big rocks up there, and you stay there till the Indians leave here." He says, "and then you go home and tell your mother what's happened." He felt sure that he was doomed to die with these Indians on the warpath coming at him. And he instructed George and got George on his way up in there to hide. And then he had this team of horses, and one of them was especially cantankerous around Indians. He just couldn't stand the sight. And animals like that will smell certain things that they don't like, and he knew the Indians, the old horse did. And they called him Old Frank. And he thought, well, he'd tie the one horse to the wagon, and he'd get Old Frank loose and hold him by the bit of the bridle. And he knew that Frank would kick up a fuss there as the Indians came near. So when the Indians came on, why, sure enough, grandfather was able to hold Old Frank by the bridle bit, and that horse would just run in circles around him like that, stomping and snorting and kicking up a big fuss. The Indians were unable to approach him, but they were closing in and getting more ready to make their attack, when all of a sudden one of the Indian braves called out and stopped the others, stopped them dead in their tracks. And he walked over then to, sometimes I get a little emotional. He walked over to grandfather, and he says, "How?" and shook hands with him. And then he says, "You called that one cold morning you took me into your cabin and warmed me and fed me, you know, and sent me on my way." So that was the Indian that he cared for, you see.
Oh, that's a neat story. That's really neat. Wow.
Other than that, I might mention that the Indians, even though when I grew a little older, I was 8, 10, 12 years old, they used to come in here in wagons. They got modern enough to have teams of horses and wagons, and they'd come in from the desert, and they would come around with a sack. They'd bring a flour sack or a gunny sack, and they'd bring it from door to door and ask you for something. They'd beg, and you give them something to eat and send them on their way. And your mom or grandma can remember some of those visits too that the Indians used to make, I believe, in Magna Quechua. And that's about my extent of the Indians. There were what we called Indian writings up Coons Canyon, and they were truly hieroglyphic writings. And I heard the professor describe what they really were, as near as anyone could tell, to try to define what type of writing they were and who had done them, And his name was Professor Kinky, and he was a professor at what used to be called the LDS University, and it was right where the church office building now stands, and he was a professor in there of archaeology. And so they had invited him out here to one of the first fathers and sons outings they had in Coons Canyon, and there were possibly about 100 of us up in there, and 2 of the older Coon family had been invited to go along. Of course, they were more or less spearheading the program, and they went along and told of incidents that they had had up in the canyon early, and they explained many incidents that took place. And there was one big rock up in there that would stand about as high as this room. It was just like a loaf of bread, and they called it it wasn't the sugar loaf, they called it the gambling spot for the Johnston's army that came in here with the early pioneers. The soldiers would be up in there and they'd gamble on this big rock, and they'd use gold pieces for exchange for money. And the boys says that they themselves had gone with their fathers up in there to get wood, and they'd always let them stop and look around this big rock, and they said themselves that they'd found gold pieces that the soldiers had let roll off. They'd get drunk and they'd be gambling, and they'd lose their little gold nuggets along there that they were using for their money. And then right on above that big rock is where these Indian writings were. And the University of Utah raided that just when it was free and open to everyone, and they took some of these big rocks with the hieroglyphics on them into the university campus. I don't know if they're still ever kept there or not, but this professor said that the nearest theory that they had, and he was with us that day, and he showed us the mountains about a mile beyond where the high peaks are, where the television towers are now. And you could see on 2 different slopes of the mountain abutments of rock that were here and here, like across a distance of maybe 1,000 yards or more, several hundred feet. He thought that some upheaval of the earth had broken down a cliff, and it just looked like that's what happened, because there was abutment of rock still on this shoulder of the mountain and one over here, and then these big rocks had been upheaved, and cast down below. But it was nearly a half mile, so it would have to have been a terrible upheaval to cause that, because these rocks were as long as that table, and they'd probably weigh 3 or 4 tons, some of them. And they had these hieroglyphics on. But you can't hardly find any more up there. I think they won't let you up in there now. The company have fenced it off, and they don't let you in there. That's a few things about Indians that I know and was kind of first right close to.
Can you think of any stories about maybe you and maybe some of your brothers or sisters, or you as a child, something kind of interesting or fun, or something that really sticks in your mind? Or
Christmas on the horseback.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
that's a story. I mentioned the last Christmas that my father was with me, and I got a set of boxing gloves. It was a Christmas of real cold weather. The snow was deep, and it was one of our real old-fashioned winters where the snow would drift high, up as high as the fences and higher, and it would drift south of our house as high as the windows here on this house, and it would come so close to the house and then it'd just leave a walkway around. The wind would break it soon enough that it didn't come right onto the house. And this winter was similar to that. It wasn't quite that, the snow wasn't quite that deep yet, but the snow was about 1.5 feet deep, and it was Christmas Eve. And my father was a watchman at the Utah Copper Mill then, and he'd work a night shift. He'd work from 4 in the afternoon till 4 in the morning. And we had the Model T car stuck in the snowdrift up above the canal. We couldn't get it out, and it had to stay up there in that cold till it thawed out a little. And my father had bought for me a nice little bay mare, and that was the joy of my heart. I had a dog to go with him. My dog Rover and that horse and I were the closest friends to me, the closest friends I ever had. But we had the little bay mare at this time, and my sister Merle and I were to ride on the little bay mare down to the T. Morey store where my sister Evelyn was working to get the Christmas candy and oranges. And as I remind you that it was Christmas Eve, and my father walked alongside my sister and I as we rode the horse through this deep snow. He walked down to Magna and watched us tie up the horse so it'd be secure. And then he had to walk on up over the hill to Magna Mill. And as Merle and I were just about to leave, and Father was leaving us there, a team of horses on a bobsleigh had got loose and were running away down Magna Main Street. And the big bobsleigh was whipping from side to side, and they were just going breakneck speed right down the highway. And a fellow who had just moved from Canada, who had married my cousin, was doing the same thing as Father, and he was walking to work. And he just got over on the opposite side of the street from us, and as the horses came by, he reached out with one hand and grabbed the horse by the bit, and that team of horses just whirled right around and pivoted in a circle, and he stopped them dead still. What had happened is the boys that were using the sleigh and had the team, they'd got out and hadn't tied up the team, and something spooked them about a mile down Main Street there, and they got loose, and they were just, they'd run wild and breakneck speed right through anything and everything.
That man was Lee Robinson.
Lee Robinson married my cousin Lavina Hardman. But they just moved down from Canada. But to continue the story, the part that Dorene likes best was we got the groceries, the nuts and oranges and candy and stuff all in 2 big paper bags, and we got on the horse. Dad helped us on, and we were ready to head back home, which was a mile away up through the heavy snows. And just as we were going to do that, why, my sister Faye, who was working at a doctor's office then as a receptionist, had been given a table lamp by the doctors as a Christmas present. So they asked us to bring that too. So we really had a load on that poor little horse, and we never had a saddle. We just had to sit bareback. As we were going up the road, why, there was a delivery truck, old Model T runabout they used to call them, like a little 1/4-ton truck, would deliver groceries around to their store customers. And there was one track down the middle of the road. This truck couldn't get out of it, and our horse didn't want to get out of it, and I thought sure the truck was going to hit us. He was not wanting to slow down, because if he'd slow down he'd get stuck, so he kept bailing on as fast as the Model T'd go, and we just got out of the tracks in time to the Magna Church house over there, and we spilled a few nuts out of the bag then. And we got up a little further, about a half mile further up, and there was a boy that had a dog that he always liked to set that dog on me and my horse when we'd go by. I was kind of afraid that would happen, and sure enough it did. But I was able to control the horse, and Merle behind me holding the bags and me holding the lamp, and we went still another 1/4 mile, and we decided we couldn't hold on or stay on the horse any longer and hold our load. So I got close enough to home where I could turn the horse loose, and Mother wouldn't be afraid that we'd been hurt. I tied the reins up tight around the horse's neck so that she could see that I'd taken measures to get off the horse and take care of the horse, you see. But and Mother didn't see that. All she saw was this horse. And when I turned the horse loose, she just ran like a cat scampering up over the farm there to the house by Mother, and Mother was frantic. She thought we'd been thrown off and our necks were broken, and so she never did see what I'd done in tying those reins up tight around the horse's neck. So when we got home, she just gave us a good Scotch blessing, and we didn't hear thanks from her at that time about getting us home okay.
Wow.
That was a...
Tell about the chocolates in the tin tub.
The what?
The chocolates in the tin tub. The chocolates and the tin tub.
Oh, my dad was quite a guy to use punch boards. He'd go on punch boards, and he seemed to have luck with punch boards. Mother didn't like that because she felt like it was a gamble, and she would always be unhappy when he'd do that. But he'd win chocolates, and this was another Christmas. We didn't have refrigerators, we did have, most of the house was cold, but what my dad did, he had an old wash tub that he put out on the ground before the snow, and it would keep the snow off the ground. But when he'd get these chocolates, he'd lift that tub up and put the chocolates under there, and it'd keep them just like your fridge would now, And so we'd have chocolates in there, and this was one winter he wasn't working at the mill, and we'd sit down around the fire at winter, pour pile wood on the fire and sit around the fire and tell stories or tell about what our activities were, and then Dad would go outside and he'd get some of these chocolates from under the old tub and bring them in. We'd have a big treat of cold chocolates there.
All right. I was going to ask you, what was school like? You hear about the one-room schoolhouses and
Well, we had a fairly modern school. My two older sisters and a brother went to what was then quite a new school, and that was the old Hawthorne School, as we call it. And it was a school that was built for 6 rooms and had a principal's office in it, and then a storage room. And then when they first had that school, they had coal stoves, a great big pot-belly stove in each schoolroom to keep it warm. But my brother Grant, as I mentioned before, coming home from school in the horse-drawn school wagon, we had moved down from Coonville to our farm home in Magna. It was Pleasant Green, later called Magna. They were at school there, my older sister Faye and Grant and Evelyn. When Grant got hit on that road coming home, Mother and Dad decided to put them in what was called the Magna School, later called the Webster School. So they brought them over in 1916. Grant was hurt in 1915. In the fall of 1916, they started there. The next year, I started school there, and they still had the big coal stoves in each room to heat the school. They didn't have central heat. They had these large pot-belly stoves. They were as tall as that lamp there. And it was cold in the fall when school first started, and the teacher was cold and no one was there to build a fire, but they were just building onto the school. All there was in that school at that time was six rooms on a 3-story school. There was 2 rooms on each floor. And of course, being in the first grade, they had us down on the ground floor. But the carpenters were still working on the addition they were building on, and there was a lot of blocks of wood out around the school. So we went out to this outside, a friend of mine, he still lives in Magna, by the way, and this was in 1916. We went out there together and got an armload of these blocks and brought it in, and the teacher got a fire going in the stove and warmed up that room that day. And soon after that, they put steam heat in. But that was my earliest recollections of school.
It's kind of interesting. Do you remember the first car or your first car?
You bet. The first car that came into our family was in September 1922. My father had never had a car before that time. And the banker in Magna, the man that they used to call him the president of the bank, he liked to have nice things, and he had this nice Model T Ford. It was really nice. In the back there was a oval-shaped glass about 8 inches oval like this, and the other old Model Ts had just had an isinglass, as we called it, or like plastic. Well, this had a big real glass window in the back, but it had side curtains, you know, for the stormy and cold weather, but it was still an open car, and you could put the top of it down, you could fold the top back, and then you've seen those old cars, maybe, and there's open like, and the back's folded down, top's folded down back, rather. And so this banker had it about a year, and he decided that he wanted a new one. So he got a new one, and my dad bought that one. That was our first car. And it was just before my brother Lavelle was born. It was in September, and as I mentioned, Lavelle was born in October. Well, my dad had never driven a car, and he didn't know much about one. And I know they didn't even have what they called a self-starter. You couldn't start it inside the car. You had to get out and crank it with a crank. So he said he didn't ever want to get a self-starter because they were too complicated. But anyway, it was this kind of a experience that he had, and just before Lavelle was born, and being up on the old farm there, the telephones were unheard of, and mother was up there, and it comes October, she was out there in stages of labor. My dad had gone to work, and he'd pick us kids up as we were coming home from school and bring us home. We helped him at his job. He had a job downtown at that time. We helped him, and he was doing custodial work at the Magna School then. But we came home, and Aunt Jen, my father's sister, who came out to be sort of a nurse when the mothers would have a baby, she came out waving her arms as we drove into the yard. We came up around the road and down over the canal and down into the old farmhouse, and Aunt Jen came out. Aunt Jen just had one eye. She'd lost the sight of one eye, and she was waving her arms like this, and her apron was flying in the wind, and she says, "Leslie, don't kill your engine, don't kill your engine." And sure enough, Dad was all excited then, and he knew about what was happening, I guess, but he got so excited, sure enough, he killed the engine. And then Aunt Jen and he started to have a little debate about what was going on, and he, after about 3 or 4 starts, got the engine started again, and he hurries off and gets the doctor. And it was getting towards sundown then, and so Dad had a lot of watermelons, nice watermelons all ready for us, and we got out in the old buggy shed. We never had garages, but we used to keep our buggies and wagons in this wagon shed, so we had that nice new car to us, out in the old buggy shed, and we sat and ate watermelons till Uncle Val made his debut about 8 o'clock that night, and we'd stayed out there enjoying nice prime watermelons in the car all that time.
Do you know about how much you paid for the first car?
Let me tell you, I think that my dad paid about $200 for that.
No.
That's quite a contrast to the one we just paid $23,900 for.
Yeah. It's a big difference. What about, do you remember your first house purchase? How much was your first house?
Yes, my folks moving down from Coonville, I don't remember what that one was at Coonville. It had been one of my uncles, and they'd moved out to a farm in the eastern part of the state. And when my folks had it for about 6 or 8 years, they sold it for $400. And then they bought their farm down here for $1,000. And my father's oldest brother, George, was a carpenter, so he built the house. And I don't know just what the lumber cost, but the ground had never had a house on it. And my folks paid $1,000 for that 10 acres. And Uncle George built the house. I imagine the materials probably cost in the neighborhood of $300 or $400, maybe $500.
In those days, how much did an average man make a day?
Well, when my father first started work at the mills up here, which was called Utah Copper, he made $1.50 a day. and it raised up to $2.25 to $2.50 a day, and they thought they were making whopping wages, $2.50 a day. When I started to work up there, I worked for $3.75 a day, and I was not a laborer. I was working as a technician. $3.75, and the laborers got about $3 a day.
That's interesting.
And we worked every day. We didn't have a day off.
Oh.
But this home here, let me tell you about this one. Mother said to me one time, after she sold the old farm finally,
Now, where is this home?
this home here.
In Magna, just so no one knows, so it's a Magna, right?
Oh, our old farm home was over right up against the hills over here. And Mother, and we had moved straight down from there, which would be about 3/4 of a mile west of here. And she had sold the old farm, and so she had some money. And she says to me, she says, "You've done a lot of things for me. I want to do something for you." And she did something for each one of us.
Oh.
And she says, she says, "I'd like to buy you a piece of ground so that when you get ready to build a home, you'll have a piece of ground to do it on." So she bought this piece of ground and gave it to me, and she paid $200 for this lot.
Wow.
And Mom and I came here. There was nothing on the ground except weeds and ants and things. But my Dorene here and I built as we had to. First, we lived in a basement. And that's when I got my job as a technician. That is an X-ray technician, the last job I had. And I had that job for well over 30 years. But Mom's father was a draftsman, and she always liked to draw plans for a home. So she said, "I'll draw some plans." And she drew plans for a small home. And she says, "How soon can we have it?" In 2 weeks, and she thought that I could build a house in 2 weeks. And
I learned.
so
You learned
then
quickly.
we built the basement, this part here we built, and we covered it, and then we built on. We built on.
3 other segments.
I'm about through with this one now. We built on to this as we needed, and we have a nice, comfortable home, and we've never had a house payment. We would buy the material and do so much, and then we'd buy and build more, and we've always been cozy and comfortable. And here, as the family grew, why we built to accommodate them, and we never have had one house payment we've owed for a home. We've gone to people and asked them for a loan, like for a car, and they say, well, who's got the mortgage on your home? Mortgage on our home. We've never had a mortgage on our home.
That's a great feeling.
And we've done it, and we've had the 12 kids, and we've had new cars and nice cars and everything we ever needed, I think.
Oh, yeah. That's great. Anything else you want to throw in?
No, I think I've more than used my share of time, I think.
That's great. Okay, Grandma, it's your turn. Down.
Well, the farthest I can remember back was my grandparents, and I remember meeting my great-grandmother several times, who had walked across the plains when she was just a little girl, and she was barefooted. And she would always tell me, "Now I'm your great-grandmother," and her name was Martha Jackson, and she married a Bolton, Martha Jackson Bolton. And Dad and I saw her on her deathbed. We were just newlyweds, and she reminded me that in those days they called everybody home to say goodbye. So we went to her home and said goodbye to her. She was dying of old age. Loveliest lady, white hair. Oh, I remember, she is so pretty. And she says, "Now, Dorene, remember, I'm the grandma that walked across the plains." So that's the one I remembered the most, and that was my grandmother Mitchell's mother. And my grandpa Mitchell's mother I knew, and she was a very sophisticated English lady, just as opposite of grandma's as you would ever see. She never took any interest in me at all. And I had been, I was a twin, and most people took interest in me, but she didn't. So I don't have any memories of her, except she just kind of ignored me. But she was sure dignified looking lady, and seemed so it seems strange because it was her son, my grandpa, that was the Irish jug passer, and he was just the opposite of being reserved. So my memories of my grandpa and Grandma Mitchell that were childhood sweethearts, we didn't know some of their history till their funerals. And then they brought out some of the interesting things. They were children when they married. They were only just barely 14 and 15 when they got married.
Wow.
And they had 13 children. And this was my father's parents. And just now, a week or so ago, my one remaining uncle of that family had his 80th birthday.
Wow.
And all of the men of this family, there were 7 sons, and every one of them, and some of the ladies, some of the sisters too, all turned to the same thing that they saw their father do, and that was the Irish custom of drinking.
Wow.
And so in our family, we do have a problem because we are potential alcoholics. Don't ever take the first drink because it seems to be a weakness in the blood.
Yeah.
I've never, ever been tempted when I saw the results of my mother's and father's breakup of their marriage because of alcohol.
Yeah.
Never been tempted. But before that, when we would go weekly up to see my grandma and Grandpa Mitchell up in the farm in Draper, they raised apples, they had lovely gardens, and I'll never forget Christmas time would have all this wonderful produce, and it was always in the cellar keeping cool, and the variety of apples I never could imagine. And always as a little child they seemed so huge and so delicious and wonderful. I never have stopped loving apples. Love them, that's my favorite fruit. Okay, that was them. And then the other grandma and grandpa, my mother's parents, they were, let's see, the ones I was just talking about, my grandpa's, was Zadok Clarence Mitchell, the father, and the mother was Florence Louisa Bolton. And then my mother's people was Annie Eliza Gledhill, and her husband was Charles Osler. And it's interesting when I see their pictures, compare them to some of my children, they look like both sets of parents. And it's interesting. I look like my grandmother Mitchell, my father's mother. I look like her. I've got her short, stocky, stubby, fat body, and I look like her. I've got her hair, her style, just even the way she wears her hair, or did wear it. Then my other grandma, Grandma Osler, my mother's mother, she was a twin, and she had lost her twin, and it was a very, I don't know any details, only that she did, and her grandmother had been a twin, and we knew that grandmothers seemed to, anyway, I was the one that broke the mold in a way, and because, no, I really didn't. At least my twin lived till we were 4, and then she passed away with diphtheria. And my twin was blonde and blue-eyed, and I was dark. And she was Irene, and I was Dorene. My father, Roy Vernal Mitchell, my mother, Violet Ada Osler Mitchell. And so I'm Dorene. Dorene Mitchell. My twin was Irene Mitchell. And then I had 2 brothers. Max is 5 years younger, and Raymond is 10 years younger, and they still are living. And Max is in Marysvale with Charlene, his wife, and Raymond is in California with his wife, Colleen. And they all have children, and they are very non-communal. We just hardly ever get in touch, but that's the way families are, some of them. We don't stay in touch. Let's see, that's as much as I can tell you about that, I guess.
Do you recall how your parents met?
Yes. Not too much, except that it was by dancing too, but I don't know where. My mother lived in Midvale. My mother was born in Nephi. My father was born in Granger. And her father, Grandpa Charles Osler, was a railroad bridge builder. And my mother has a history. I've written my mother's history. And it has in there that when they were living on a kind of a box car, it was called a family car, and it was a bunk house. A house car, yeah. And talk about railroads in here. Anyway, my mother has a cute story that you might want to hear. When she was a little girl, she'd always had instructions for them never to ever open the windows whenever there was a crash or if there was going to be one, because the windows would come down on them. And she'd forgotten the warning, and there was a lot of tooting going on. Their train had stopped, and they knew a train was coming right towards them. And they were pretty sure it was going to crash into them. They couldn't stop it. And there they were waiting, and all the yelling and screaming, and my mother and her sister had both been abandoned in the car, and her mother, who was supposed to cook for the crew while they were building the bridges, and she was doing something else. She wasn't in the car with them. And with all the screaming and yelling and everything, and they could hear the tooting of the train getting closer, and they knew, So out they did. They put my mother and her sister put their heads out the window, and sure enough, the window flopped right down, and it just pinned them right there. And they were screaming and screaming, and nobody could hear them for the noise, because when the train hit, the engineer jumped out of the train, and there was I think Mom said it was the Humboldt River right there by him, and he landed right on this post, and his suspenders caught on the post, and his arms and legs were just flailing. She's told me that. She says, and we were just laughing, and here we were, and our heads were stuck in the window. So when she says, my mother finally heard us and come and released us, and she scolded us. She says, I told you that would happen, and it did. They didn't ever do it again. She had some interesting stories to tell about living on the railroad. And, wherever the job was, they'd live on that railroad, much like, I guess, we live in trailers these days.
Tell us a couple.
Well, some of the stories I know I've told Mark, and Mark's just was fascinated because he likes the railroad too. But, she said one thing that was hard was new schools every year and new sets of friends. But Mom was a good scholar. She had beautiful penmanship. I never could ever come near it.
I got that from you then, Grandma.
I I just too sloppy. But she would always do it so well. Well, that's about all I can tell you, I think, about that.
Let's see. So how many brothers and sisters? You have 2 brothers.
Mhm.
And do you have any childhood memories with?
Oh, you want to hear a funny story about
Sure.
Max and me?
Okay.
I was the big sister, and I was always the babysitter, of course, and it was always my fault when things went wrong. And it was always the oldest one's responsibility to look out for things. And so the neighborhood kids I was born and raised here in Magna, just around the corner from Dad. And we had always been neighbors forever. And so, anyway, we had an empty corner lot about how far up the street?
Simmons's?
Uh-huh.
Oh, just couple hundred feet.
Okay, 100 feet away, say. And the kids would all gather there in the dusk of the evening in the summertime, and we would have what was called a rock fight. But we were very gentle about it. Nobody ever got hurt. We'd just heave the rocks at the big rocks we were hiding behind. Nobody ever got hit. So my little brother Max was behind me, and he raises up behind the rock, and he's, what's going on out there? And he gets one right there. So guess who got blamed for that? You don't take your little brother.
Tell them about the ice wagon.
Okay, then there was an incident longer before that, before it was while me and my sister were in the mischievous age, and we had gotten into trouble. We were always running away.
Now, what's your sister's name?
Irene.
Oh, your twin?
This is my twin. And so we had been grounded, and Mama was in the house having a nervous breakdown. And we'd been grounded and told to stay in the yard. And so Irene said to me, now, Dorene, I'll mind what Mama said. I'll sit here on the step while you go and get up on the ice wagon and get us each a piece of ice. The ice wagon would always come by every day and stop right in front of our house. And usually we were allowed to get up on the steps, reach up and get a piece of ice for our hands. And then we'd, anyway, Doreen didn't even think about it. Oh, sure, that'll do. If you're minding Mother, then I can go get the ice. So I get up on the ice wagon, and I get the ice, and I jump down off the step right into the path of a car, and the car hit me. And they carried me. I remember I wasn't right out. I must have been not cuckoo, because I still had the melting ice in my hands, and they were taking me across the street, because the neighbors said they knew Mother was having a nervous breakdown, so I wasn't. I was taken in and I didn't want to go in that house. And I remember I was trying to tell them I was all right. But I got in trouble, and Irene got off scot-free.
Oh,
She didn't even get blamed.
She talked you into it.
Yeah, she never got her ice either.
What's some other stories you can remember about Irene?
Oh, I can remember being self-conscious about the fact that we did cute things together, that we were unusual. We didn't go anywhere. We stayed home all the time. Can't figure that out. And I remember having company in the front yard. And in the backyard, the children were playing. It was summer. That's what you did in the summer. There was no air conditioning. So we had this company from Draper, and they were my father's people. And they saw us coming around the corner of the house, Irene and I, and we were swinging hands back, and holding hands and swinging. And they said, "Oh, look, isn't that cute?" And I glanced up and realized they were meaning us. And we looked down at our hands real quick like this, and we dropped our hands without a word. We just dropped our hands and self-conscious, I guess. I remember that very well.
So you're real close with her.
Uh-huh, yeah.
Do you remember when she passed away?
Oh, I'll say.
What do you remember?
Very painful, yet. I didn't realize that she was dead. See, she died of diphtheria, and she was just sick overnight, and they brought her back. They were on their way to the hospital, and she died in my daddy's arms. And when they brought her back to the house, then they had to communicate, and the details escape me some, but she wasn't even embalmed. They were going to bury her the very next day. They didn't embalm her, but he prepared the body, whatever he did, but he didn't embalm her because it was a contagious disease, and they were afraid of that. In fact, she couldn't even have a funeral, and they had the little teeny casket right in front of the big bay window. And they just opened the curtains and put her casket there. And I didn't know she was I thought she was just asleep in that beautiful little box. And she had a pretty little yellow dress on. And I was hurting because they didn't give me one. And I thought, why don't I have a dress to match? And I was trying to communicate, and they wasn't able to communicate. And I sat in my high chair at the foot of her casket and watched the neighborhood children file by. And they were all crying, and I couldn't figure out why. And I don't know. Everybody was so sad, and I couldn't figure out why, because I really thought Irene was just asleep. And when it was time then, after that, then they had the hearse. The casket was being lowered. And as they lowered it into the ground, then I realized that she was gone. I mean, she was going, and they had to restrain me. I was just ready to jump in. They caught me in midair. I was going right in with her.
You were going to go with her. Wow.
I remember that.
So,
They couldn't explain it too easy, that she was dead. I didn't know what dead was. I had to find out what dead meant.
so when she just wasn't around, you figured...
Well, then when I knew they were putting her in the ground, that was it. They wouldn't do that unless... And I never known what death was or anything, so I had to find out that way.
That's hard.
Yeah. So that was not a kind way to find out. And my mother was so wonderful to me to explain it. And she told me so many wonderful things about being a mother of twins. And, yeah, she just didn't leave anything out. I just almost really feel grateful for that. And the pictures my daddy had taken of us, he was so proud. Got quite a few pictures of us when we were little.
You were both really small when you were born. How
Yeah.
much did you weigh, Grandma?
Well, she was little. She was 2.5, and I was big. I was 3 pounds.
Wow.
And she was born first, and then I was born feet first. And as I was being born, the doctor hadn't made it. And as I was being born, he walked in the door, and my feet were there. And he just went over, and he saved me. I mean, he saved my life. Usually those babies die if they don't have the right assistance at that moment, because they're smothered, they suffocate. Their faces are in the wrong place. When they're supposed to be born head first, you see, they don't smother.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, I was born feet first. So I was born the wrong way, and that's why I've always been crazy.
And then did they keep you in a shoebox? How'd they keep you
Yeah, they
warm?
had to put us on the oven door. And when the doctor saw us, and he says, "Oh, they're so underdeveloped," he says, "I don't see how they're ever going to make it. You better get them named right away." And so I was noticing the date was born the 11th of December, and we were blessed the 13th. And the bishop blessed my sister, and me. The bishop blessed me, and my grandfather Osler blessed Irene. And so that's how they did it. Didn't even get us to church.
Oh, wow.
But my grandma was there, the one that had been a twin and lost hers. And Mom told me this many times. She'd say, "Ada, do everything you can so these babies don't have to be separated." Because it's so hard to be a twin and have lost one like that. And she did too. I think Mom did a beautiful job. But let me tell you, there was a time when Mom got to time to go to bed at night, and the babies were screaming, and there was no baby food, and she had done all she could in nursing, but it didn't look like the nursing was doing it. So one night, I don't know, someone advised her, but she took some homemade bread, broke it up into some warm milk, and fed us that. And from then on, every night before we went to bed, we had bread and milk. And I still love this stuff, only not with warm milk. But she said that that's what saved our lives. That's when we started getting healthy. She said until that time we just were so poor.
Wow.
And when Dr. McBride would see me downtown, he was the doctor. He was a little old-fashioned guy. He had a little goatee beard, and he'd always have a funny little pipe like this. And he would take his pipe out and he'd say, "Gee, you sure do look good, little twin," he'd say to me. He remembered really well.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah, he was surprised that Mom could do it.
Wow. So you were the oldest.
Mm-hmm.
Oldest. And
No, she was the oldest. She was born first, 15 minutes before I was.
the oldest children. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we were first children, yeah.
Huh.
And I know that Irene's death really was a terrible blow to Mom and to Dad. And Daddy, when he would drink, he would cry and cry. Why did she have to die?
Oh.
Why did it have to be in my arms? And it made him really hurt. He suffered a lot over it.
Oh, I bet.
And when I would go through that with him, sometimes I would just be really, I wasn't very old, and I'd think, it should have been me that died. Then he wouldn't have felt so bad.
Oh,
I'd feel that, but I'd never
Yeah.
communicated. It was a long time
Right.
before I,
sure.
yeah.
How old were you when your parents finally divorced?
Well, I graduated from high school. I was
So you were
17. But it was going on. When I was 12 and 13, it was so serious, and they were trying so hard. I mean, Mama was. Grandpa
a
didn't.
hard thing to go
No, he didn't try. He loved it. And if he wanted to, he could quit. I've taken 3 cures now, and if I wanted to be cured, I'd be cured. I wouldn't need help to do it.
Yeah.
Everybody tried to help him, but he couldn't.
Well, so how did he die?
He died an alcoholic death, but I don't really know the cause of death.
When did he die? Do you know when he died? A year, maybe?
Oh, I can't tell you right now. I've got it in my records.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
About how
He
old
he
were you?
married a drinking partner after he and Mama
Oh.
divorced.
Mhm.
A lady that was a drinker. So,
And did your mom remarry?
yeah, Frances Dooley, and it turned out kind of sad because he was dying of senility, and he was such a young man looking in that, but he just had a terrible time. And so she was a widow for she was only married for a couple of years, wasn't she? Yeah, to him.
So they never had children.
Oh, no.
They just married.
Oh, she was an old lady when she got married to him.
And then what about Grandma, your mother? How did she die?
Oh, she died of a stroke. Yeah. She died of she had 2 sets of strokes, and we tried to take care of her, and it was hard too because we couldn't communicate, she couldn't talk, and it was rough.
And she lived with you. How long did this go on?
Well, we thought she was getting better. We could understand her a little better, and she was on her walker, and she wouldn't tip over sideways. After about a year, she could walk on her walker better. And then the thing was, she fell and broke her hip there at the rest home. And then she went to the hospital and had surgery on it, and she didn't survive the surgery. She went into comatose, and then we all said goodbye to her.
Yeah. That makes you feel good. So all your brothers are living,
My 2 brothers,
Your 2
yes.
brothers.
Uh-huh.
but you don't really talk to them.
Well, I try and stay in touch once a year at least and
Sure.
talk to them.
Do you have any other childhood memories or anything?
Well, Raymond was my baby.
Mhm.
He called me Dorene. I was 10 years old when he was born, and he liked me better than Mama.
Uh-huh.
And I shouldn't say that, but he did. And we all 3 had our tonsils out together. And I mean together. I was first, then Max was next, and then Raymond. And as I was coming out of the anesthetic, very ill, I was, how old? About 12 or 13. I could hear Raymond calling me, Dorene. And when he woke up, he was just screaming, and they couldn't console him. They said, "You're going to have to slide on your side on this narrow little tiny thing." I was fat even then, and I had to turn sideways, and he had to be laid by me because he wanted Dorene. So doesn't that tell you? Yeah, he didn't want Mommy, he wanted Dorene. Oh, that was a horrible feeling to wake up to that tonsillectomy.
Oh,
Hate it.
In those days, if one child gets sick, didn't they put them all together? Or
I remember being in quarantine for scarlet fever all one summer
Yeah.
when I was in the 6th grade. And I got it first, then Max, and then Raymond. And we were in quarantine 6 weeks each, all three.
Wow.
And poor Mama, she just was the best little nurse. And during that time, Daddy was remodeling the back of the house and digging out under the basement, making it bigger and getting us a bathroom. That was when I was 13. We had a bathroom in the works, and I couldn't hardly believe it. It was a marvelous thing, a bathtub and a toilet that flushed, and oh, it was great. It wasn't too neat to not have a bathroom in the house.
Before you got your bathtub, what would you do? How would you?
Oh,
Often
yeah.
Did you bathe?
Oh, every Saturday night, and I was the last because I was the oldest. And the youngest got first. And then they'd put a tea kettle of hot water in to warm up the water for the second one, and then another tea kettle into. And so my water was murky by the time those two mean, dirty little brothers got through.
So you
One
should
time,
water.
we had a pot-bellied stove. We'd always bath around the pot-bellied stove. One time, I leaned a little too much to one side and burned the cheek of my bottom right against the open. I mean, it was one of these heaters that wasn't protected. It was just sheet metal. And it just, you could hear it sizzle just like, and I had myself a nasty burn.
Could you sit down?
Not for a while. I couldn't stand it. Oh, man, I'll never forget how that sounded. I thought, I'm cooked.
She had to lie on
And
her
I didn't
stomach.
think I was going to get away from that. I stuck right there. I had to move away, and part of me was left on there. Ugh.
How were the winters then?
Oh, it seemed like they were so cold because we didn't have central heating. And I remember head cheese being made out of the pig's head, the fat part of the head. And we would have that on the back porch to stay cold all winter. And I'd take head cheese sandwiches to school. You don't turn up your nose, Holly. That's the best delicacy. I just would love a bite right now. Oh, that
It
was
made
so
out of a
delicious.
pig's head.
Uh-huh. We'd always ask for the tail and the head.
Well,
Have you ever
explain that.
tasted the tail? You bake it in the oven and you take it out. You know these little pork crisps that you buy? That's what it tastes like. But the head cheese is just something else. You slice it real thin and put it on bread, put mustard, and it's
How
just
would you
delicious.
make it? I mean,
I don't know how they made it. They boiled everything in a great big
boiled it in
pot.
Pig's head.
Uh-huh, they boiled everything, cleaned what, and then just boiled the whole thing. Or else, I don't know that part. All I know is it was cooked and then poured into the pan and allowed to settle. I don't know if there was gelatin in it, because it's set up.
What was your schoolhouse like?
Oh, it was the same one Dad went to.
Oh, what?
Good old Magnet or Webster School. Yeah, in fact, I got to know Dad a little bit when I was in 3rd grade, and my teacher kept sending me down to see him and say, "It's sure cold up in our room." And he'd say, "What was it you said?" "Oh, Miss Neff."
Oh, don't tell that part now.
"Why?"
I was nice for a long while. She'd keep sending Dorene down. Dorene says that she had a teacher had a case on me, and she'd send me down to come
Every
start her
time.
clock or set her clock or something, you know.
Twice a day at least.
And so what I did, I married her student later.
Oh.
You did that, huh? I married you. Okay.
Okay.
Holly?
Anything else you can think of?
Holly?
Grandma, yes,
Oh, go ahead. I was going to ask when you get through if we could kind of go briefly over what we've done together since we've been married, you know.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I want Grandma,
We
though,
don't
to
have any of your courtship in that.
No,
yeah,
that's
I
what we want to do
Grandma
next.
to tell us how you met.
Okay. Well, you already, are you recording still? Okay. What I needed to tell you was I'd always noticed Dad. I've always known he was so polite. And my theory was if he took that good a care of his mother, he would be an awfully nice husband because he'd be good to his wife.
Little did I know.
Little did you know. And I had not thought of him only just as a friend because he was really such a polite fellow. And it was so fun to be around him. And we ended up being thrown together through the wards things and the stake activities. We got together through singing in a chorus together. It was a stake chorus, and that year we were going to all the hospitals in the Salt Lake area. That was in 1942. And we were singing. We'd either take a bus or private cars, and he had this beautiful brand new shiny black car. And we were going the same direction, And he would pick me up on the way because I was walking in a long dress and it was muddy and snowy. And then I'd get in the car and I started noticing him a little more and a little more. The car made me notice him more, and I'm just being terribly blunt. I'm sorry you're here listening to this.
So am I.
Anyway, the first time that happened and I got in the back seat of his little club coupe, you know, there's not much room. I smacked my head as I got in and I says, "Ooh, this darn car." And I touched my head and he says, call me Nordine instead of Dorene. And I says, "My name's Dorene." He says, "I know, but you didn't like my car." And then at that time, he also was, had other girls there. And there was a real cute little girl that I thought was my friend, and she was snuggled right up to him just like this. And I thought, oh, if she can take an interest like that, maybe I could. I'll just wait. And if he should ask me out, I'll go out with him. And that was the first thing. And then we go to seminary for the practice for our chorus, and we go early. I don't think we went together during that time. He didn't pick me up. I just walked there on my own. And they would sit there and match pennies while we was waiting for everybody to come. And I stole all these pennies, took all these pennies.
She's been taking them ever since.
Yeah.
Pennies, it's dollars now. Pennies don't do a thing. But anyway, I remember flirting with him and thinking he was sure cute. And anyway, I got to tell you this. Long before that, when I was on my way to high school, I would deliberately be late. And I'd stand on his gate, hang on to his gate and talk to him while he was working in his mother's garden. And I had sort of just set my cap for him, but I still only thought of him as a good friend. So we were good friends. I felt he was one of the best friends I could have ever had. And until he asked me to marry him, I didn't really fall for him. And when he asked me to marry him, Holly, I mean this, I knew the Lord let me know he was to be my husband. Because when he asked me, suddenly I was lifted up out of my body and my spirit looked down on us sitting there in the car. And the knowledge came to me that it was to be. The Lord wanted it to be. He says I didn't even hesitate. And I said, yes, but there was a long time in there that this happened. And it seemed like everything went on hold for a minute while I absorbed it. And he says, I said yes right away. But there was a space that he didn't know about.
I believe she's been looking down on me ever since, Holly.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was, he proposed just before Valentine's Day. And so it would be just about now, 50 years ago, that he proposed to me.
Right on Valentine's Day.
And on Valentine's Day, he brought me the most beautiful heart candy, just gorgeous. Oh, Martha Washington with all those different colors, not just chocolate, you know. And we took that and we went to all our families and told them that we were going to get married. Oh. His families and mine, and we just shared those chocolates with everybody, and that was the big thing. And officially, we were, without the ring, we were engaged on Valentine's Day.
So when did you get your ring?
It was a while.
3rd of April,
Yeah.
2 months.
I didn't get my engagement ring until we got married. Then I got them both, and I had 2.
So when did you get married?
The 3rd of April, 1942. And our first date was Christmas Eve, 1941. And on the 7th of December, just before that, was Pearl Harbor Day, and we were together in his beautiful car, returning from a performance, and we turned on the radio and heard that about Pearl Harbor being bombed.
Oh.
And we were together, that just as a group. There were others there. Mm-hmm. I turned on the radio that brought it on and said, Pearl Harbor's been bombed.
So do you tell me what you remember about the war?
Well, I know that all my friends from school went into the service, and many didn't return. And, you know, it's the sad stories, and some of the girls did, too. There was, our class probably lost more young people. You know, like war will do that to young people, and they went into all branches of the service. And so the war, when it ended, we were in this basement house here, and Barbara was having her first birthday, and everybody was celebrating. And we didn't have any refrigeration here, just a little ice box. And I had made a hand-cranked thing of ice cream for her birthday, and I went next door to the neighbors and told them to take the rest of the ice cream and put it in their freezer because, you know, it was going to go to waste. But there was shots being fired in our neighborhood in celebration of the war ending, and on our flat roof here, the bullets were landing on them. thud, thud, thud. We could hear it so loud. We just felt like we were not safe in our little house.
They were
Because of
shooting
the-
shotguns, and the BBs had come hitting on top.
We
of
could
the
hear
house.
them hitting, but it didn't damage. It just was scary to hear it, Yeah. But my father, your mother, when she was real little, would give the cutest prayer for the 3 people in the service of our family. My father was in the merchant Marines, and Legrand, his brother, was in the Army, and Lavelle joined the Navy. So her little prayer every night was, and she couldn't say it plain, and she'd say, "Bless Uncle Dan in the Army, and bless Uncle Hade," that's Sade, "in the Navy, and Dwampa in the Marines." I never forget the way she talked, so cute.
That was my mother.
That was Judy.
Judy.
Hmm.
Oh.
And little Barbara was not too far behind her, and Barbara talked with the southern accent just like she'd been born back in the South.
All right.
Well, we have 12 children, so each one just as cute and precious as the first 2. And when we had Barbara, the second little girl, I knew we'd never have a son. And we argued, and I says to Dad, "Now, she's supposed to be Barbara Jean, so that you'll have a little one named after you, because Judith Ann," and then, anyway, he needed a little one to be named after him. And he says, "No, she looks like you, so it's got to be Barbara Dorene." And so he won because he took her up to get her named. So then we had 8 little boys.
I named her what I wanted.
So she didn't have a choice.
No.
So it turned out we had 8 boys after that. Dad must have known something I didn't.
Yeah.
And so we had Alonzo Eugene, we had Leslie Dare, we had Guy Mitchell Sadler, then we had Gary Osler Sadler, then we had, Gary, then Robert Lynn, and then Mark Charles, and then Kay Richard, and Don Russell. Not Donald, Don. By that time we knew the name had to be short, because I would go down the whole list. And then we got those 2 little angels after those 8 boys. Oh, what a shock and a surprise to get 2 little girls again. And that was Annette, Irene, and Lorie, Amelia.
Amelia.
And that was the 12.
Did my mom get a name from anywhere, or did you just like the name Judy?
It was
very
from
popular.
Judy. It was from Judy Garland. She was just a beautiful, blooming actress and such a good singer. And Anne was the inherited name from both sides. Both sides of our genealogy has Anne. And so I liked Anne too. But when she started school, there were so many Judy Anns that it was hard for the teachers. There was at least 5 in her class. Judith Anns, and some were Judy Ann, some were Judith, some were Sadler. I mean, they had to almost bring in the last names.
Let's put it this way. It was so popular that they started to call their dogs and cats Judy.
Yeah, Dr. Chase had a dog named Judy.
The doctor I worked with called his dog Judy.
That's funny. Well, Grandpa, do you have any stories of a date you guys went on when you got married, or?
I kind of wanted to tell you a little bit about my grandfather Sadler, my grandparents on the
Okay,
side.
sure.
Should I do that now?
You bet.
Okay. My grandfather Sadler was a convert to the church from Sheffield, England, and he'd been a merchant. He was quite a business-like type of person, but he joined the church and he wanted to come here to Utah. So he brought his first wife with him, and he stayed in Nauvoo for a little while, and the people never had much medicine in those days for different things, and they'd use certain types of food. They'd say, well, use tea for this, and they used what they called the preserved peaches for cholera. A lot of the Mormon pioneers got cholera, and Brigham Young had sent word back here from Salt Lake after he arrived to bring all the preserved peaches they could. And the preserved peaches were quite strong, but they were a candied peach-like. And he says, bring all you can. So my grandfather Sadler and his wife got with a company that were just organizing to come out, and he got the word that Brigham Young wanted the peaches. So they got a 5-gallon crock full of these preserved peaches and started across the plains. And so many of their company got the cholera that they used all the peaches for. Brigham Young got a chance at them, see. Well, when my grandfather got here, he says to Brigham Young, he'd always interview these people that were converts, coming in, from England. He says, well, what's your trade? And they all had trades, like coming from Europe, they were skilled people, most of them. And so my grandfather says, well, he says, I'm a comb maker by trade, but he'd been a merchant. But I think he sensed that combs would be quite an item they'd be looking for here. There's no manufacturing of any kind here. And Brigham Young says, well, good. He says, we'll put you right to work making combs. He says, you can use ox horns or whatever. And grandfather knew that. He says, and make combs. So he says the first home he built was just a 2-room place. A lot of them didn't even have a home, but he built this little 2-room place. And he says that nobody had money, so for the combs, people would bring him wheat in exchange, barter, And so he says, I soon had those 2 rooms full of wheat, and I had to build me another house. So Grandma and I were looking at a map of the lots, the property lots that people had been assigned by Brigham Young, or the heads of the church, and Grandfather Sadler's on that one plot. And he, one time, owned the property where the Walker Bank building stands, a quarter of that block. And they were always bartering and dickering without money. They'd trade and barter, for different things. So someone came along with a brand new wagon and a fine ox team, and Grandfather traded that quarter of that city block where Walker Bank building is, east where the telephone company is, where he was. He traded that to this man for his oxen and a new wagon. And his 2 sons were so angry at him, they never felt the same toward him for trading that nice city property off that became worth millions of dollars, And so he did that. And then he used to peddle. He got being a merchant in merchandising in his blood. Why he'd get a wagon full of things, items that people needed, in their homes, and they'd go peddling out as far as Camas. And he'd take a sack of grain along to feed his horses grain, along with some hay. And at night, my dad says that he can remember Grandfather Sadler taking his cash bag that he'd collected during the day, and he'd hide it in the middle of this grain. He'd put it way down in the middle of the grain when he'd go to bed at night. And then he had an old dog with him that he had along for protection too. And he says he'd talk to that old dog and tell the old dog where he's hiding the money, and he says he just like he was talking to a person. My dad was a little boy just going along for company. And anyway, that's the way my grandfather did. And then he became a polygamist. He married a second wife. And he had 12 children by the first wife, and he had 14 by the second wife. And we come through the second wife. My grandmother Sadler was the second wife in the polygamous family. And the other family mostly left Salt Lake. They were quite well educated. They worked in the city and county offices and things like that. But most of them moved to California, and we lost touch with them, except one uncle, and his name was Zalma. And he used to meet me when I was working for the railroad, and I'd be off during the day and want just street walk or something, or window shop, I'd run into him lots of times. And he was always dressed so prim and neat, and he always worked for most of his life in the city and county building for an office job. And he talked to me, but he was proud, and he liked to talk with me, and he was a man about 35, 40 years older than I was. And he would just bump into each other on the street, and I tried to get him to come out here. I'd offer to bring him out here for Thanksgiving dinner, and he'd always have some excuse. No. Then I'd want to take him up to his apartment when he was getting feeble, and I wanted to help him up to his apartment. He was kind of staggering, And he'd get to the railing on the stairway, and he'd say, no, I can make it. And here he was almost tipping over backwards. And then he finally died, and I never got to him. But I wanted to tell you this about your mother and I. We were always active in church. And when I was a young man, even though I didn't go courting much at all, I say till I was 26, really.
You mean me?
When I was anybody.
You mean me? You and me?
When I was ordained an elder, and I was 19, they put me right into the presidency as a counselor in the elders' quorum. So I was with men that were old enough to be my father, and I stayed in there for a couple of years, and then I got out. And then they put me in the Sunday school, what they call superintendency. They had 3 men, a superintendent and 2 counselors. So I was the first counselor for a number of years. And Mom was just a Sunday school girl then. And I saw her once in a while, And she didn't really attract my attention to her till she was about 14 years older, and she started to bloom out, you know. That's when she's going, just before she'd be walking down to school there. And so from then on, when we got married, why, I was called to be in the state MIA superintendency. And I was that for a year, and then I was called in as a secretary of the 70s quorum. And the 70s, they don't have many more. They just have 70 in Salt Lake. They have 2 quorums in there, but they had them in each state. They had a quorum. So I was the secretary of our quorum. Then they reorganized, and in what year was Les born? 49.
49.
In 1948, they called me to be the senior president. They have 7 presidents. So I was senior president for 14 years, and there were 26 other men that worked with me, but they kept me in as the senior president. And during that time, I was also, 6 of those years, I was acting as a mission president, state mission president. And that included Garfield from Tooele over to Hunter. And we had a big enough mission. We had 50 missionaries, and we had districts like they do in the regular full-time mission. So we had district presidents, and he had 2 assistants. And then we had a big map that charted this whole community from all the way that Garfield was here then, and Magna and Lake Ridge. And we had that all charted out, and the elders would keep track of their progress on this with little markers on their big map, you know, and we'd study that map once a week when we'd all get together. And Mom, I asked for Mom to be my secretary. Here she was. She'd given birth by now to up to, 54. That was Mark. She'd given birth to the kids up to Bob. And then during the 6 years that I was mission president, she was secretary, she gave birth to 4 more children and was still secretary. And us building our home like we were, and me working every day at the mill, and being mission president as well as president of the quorum. And I was I was a senior president, and I had to everything had to come into me, you know. And so Mom was the secretary, and they kept mothers in the hospital when they had babies then for about 6 days or a week. And I remember her making out from 4 different times, 4 different babies during that 6 years. She was making out that monthly report as she lay in her hospital bed. And one time she fell up here with Don. He hadn't been born yet, but she slipped and fell in the gutter, this deep gutter here. And so I thought I'd let you know that was the happiest years, really. They were really happy years.
It was great.
And our oldest 2 girls, your mother and her sister Barbara, we put them downstairs. We were living up here then, and we had a nice vacant cool room down there. It was summertime, and they trained missionaries coming in. Your mother was about 15 or 16, and Barbara was 14. I think they're about 15 and 17. And they trained those missionaries, and 2 of them, I remember, were lady secretaries from the high school. They'd graduated, and they had this job as secretaries at the school, and they were twin sisters.
Irene and Eileen Hulse.
They were Magna girls.
Oh, really? Irene?
And they lived right by the Magna Ward. They were raised over there. But they were single. They were spinsters, and they were about in their late 20s. And your mother and Barbara gave them the missionary lessons.
And
now,
they did it good, too.
he'll know what missionary programs are like, you know. And they did a real good job of it. But then when Annette was born, it was January. She was born in December, the 29th. And then in January, we had a prime contact, your mother and I. The man's name was Boyer, like that movie star Boyer.
Oh.
And they were out here at Lake Ridge, and he and his wife were just anxious to get to know all about the church. And so the day we had a date set for them, there was a blizzard came up, and the snow was all close to a foot deep. And we got this little girl. She was less than a month old, I believe, Annette. We got her in her bassinet, bundled her all up. I got the books, and I asked Mother here to carry the books in, and we'd bought a brand new Bible. and Mom was carrying the books, and I went ahead of her with the bassinet to this house. We weren't going to call it off, or we didn't want to cancel, you know. They were such golden prospects that we wanted to get them. So as I went ahead, Mom was trying to stay in my footprints, and she slipped and fell, and this brand new Bible came open. We'd never used it before. It was brand new, and it fell open in the snow, you know, got snow on the pages. And we got in the house and shook the snow out, and it's still wrinkled. You ought to
Never will be the same.
You ought to go get it, Mom.
No, no.
And so we did that, and we were that devoted to those callings, and we had this family, big as they were, and she was next to the last baby we had there.
There was
11.
Mark, Kay, Don, Annette, and Lorie that were born during that. Well, Lorie wasn't during that time, but Mark, Kay, and Don went on missions.
Well, then after that, it went on for a while. Now, like I say, there were 26 other men called in and as presidents, and then while I was still the senior president of that quorum, and then they released me from that, and they ordained me a high priest, and then they put me on the high council, and I was on the high council for about 8 years, and so that is some of the activity that we've been in. And since then, after I worked on the high council for 10 years, and by the way, I was an elder for I was an elder for 10 years. Then I was an elder for 8 years, I guess. And then I was a 70 for 30 years. And then I've been a high priest for 30 years. So I've been in the priesthood quorums that long as an adult, see. Then after I was released from the high council, then I was given other jobs. We worked around here until then they called us on a mission. And we went to those 2 missions, to Samoa and to Wisconsin. And then we came back, and then they had us on another mission here. And then they gave us the work of what they call the Family to Family Book of Mormon State Coordinator. So we went from ward to ward and promoted the sale of Book of Mormons in those wards to send out to the missions. He'd know what, he got some himself, probably like that. So we coordinated that up till a year ago when they changed that program, and we've been out. Then they called me in as an assistant to the high priest group leadership here. And in that time I was a high priest before. I was a high priest group leader in the ward for about a year. Then they called me on the high council.
Guess what they asked me to do? I finally made it somewhere. I love music so well, and Dad and I have always sung in the choirs and choruses, wherever we're asked, in the wards and stakes. Through all the years, we've always stayed in a choir and a chorus. Even in the missions we did. Can you imagine singing with the Samoans?
And that's what you did.
We'd sing Samoan too.
Yeah, we'd even sing it in their language. That's one way. We didn't know what the words meant, but we knew the songs. And so we just listened to them and sing what they sang, and it was fun. But anyway, so recently I was given a calling, I guess I've had it for a while, of being the secretary, is it?
The president.
Oh, I'm president of the choir in a ward, yeah. And I have to call all the choir members and say, it's choir practice tomorrow at 9:30, don't forget. Anyway, it's kind of fun to be part of the music, you know.
We used to sing on our mission at the mission home. The president insisted on it. He gave me the assignment to conduct a devotional every morning.
At 8 o'clock.
And we'd sing in Samoan. We'd get their Samoan songbooks and sing all our songs. We knew the music to it, you know, and then we'd sing in Samoan.
Oh, they sing so good.
They always had someone to play, too.
Yeah, little pump organ.
So that's been our activity since we got married. We were always active.
It was wonderful to be missionaries together, companions like that.
Tell us a little bit about the mission.
Okay, well, it was fun. It was just wonderful to get, you know, I said I always wanted to see what Gilligan's Island was like, and as soon as I saw it as we landed, I says, yep, Gilligan's Island. That's what it is. It's just like camping out all the time. And for almost a year, we were really having trouble with dieting. The kind of food that we had to get was mostly from the cans off the shelves. And I was lucky because I was where I was. I would hear where all the foodstuffs would come, and they'd be sold to the Palongis. We're called Palongis, the people that are not born there. You know, the Palongis are the Anglo-Saxon.
Anglo.
So anyway, down there, we were secretaries to the Palangi president, which was President Harris, and he had been a boy missionary there. And then they'd called him back and he brought his family. And so we had those little children, and we got to tend them a lot while they went hobnobbing with the general authorities. And we got to meet general authorities down there.
I'll have to tell you what Mom said. She says, when I get you down that island, she says, it's going to be Honeymoon Island for sure. And then after a while, she says, well, you don't need to overdo it.
We had twin beds that we pushed together. They told us to bring king-size sheets. They told us what to bring. And don't bring a blanket, don't bring a jacket. And here we are from Utah, and we don't ever even need a jacket. That whole year we're down there. Actually, we didn't either. We didn't ever need anything like that. In fact, I took the wrong clothes. I didn't know it. I took cotton, though. I did take cotton. But I made long dresses, and they were just too hot. I had to cut them off below the knee. I just couldn't stand all that. So then I used the material that I cut it off, and I found a sewing machine, and we made some things for Christmas, and we did a lot of things. And nothing changed as far as that went. Every spare minute I used to do some fun little gadget and thing, and Dad helped me. I had to make smocks and things to wear with skirts.
You ought to tell them about Chris Sandoval.
Oh, yeah.
Let me tell them about
You
it.
do that one.
We had the temple pretty well built, and we were hobnobbing with the man that was in charge. He was quality control man. He checked everything and made see it was going right, you know. So on Saturdays, we usually wanted to break. And he says, would you like to go with the wife and I out to get some trees, and we'll plant the first trees at the temple here. And they were just finishing the temple off. They were putting the coating on the outside. It's like a stucco coating, but it's a special coating. And when we were putting the trees in, I says to Mom, I says, slip over to the cottage. It was just a couple of hundred feet away. I says, get the Kodak and I'll take your pictures by these first trees. So she did in a few minutes, had the pictures taken. This young man was just finishing off. It was on the west side, and the sun wasn't beating in there yet, and he was staying in the shade, working with the shady, just finishing that side. And I says to him, I looked up, he's way up high on the scaffold, and I says, turn around, young man, let me get a shot at you, will you? And he looked down, and he got out there, you know, for us, and he looked down, he saw Mom's name tag. We had to wear them wherever we went, you know. So when he saw that tag, he hopped down and came down on the ground, and he says, you're the people I've been looking for. He says, ever since I came here. He says, your son-in-law, who he was supposed to be the best man at Lorie's wedding.
They were best friends.
He was working away and couldn't be the best man. So this was a year later that Randy called and says, or he called Randy when they were living in California, and he says, Chris says to Randy, he says, guess what? He says, I'm going down to Samoa to finish that temple off down there. And Randy says, well, when did you do? He says, good, look my folks up. He says, they're down there on a mission. He says, okay, I will. What's their name? And he says, Sadler. So he says, okay, I'll look him up. And when he got down there, he couldn't remember the name. And here he was, almost through with the temple, and that name never would come back to him. But when he saw Mom's name tag, he says, that's the name I've been looking for. And
he was just like a long-lost son we'd never had. He came into our cottage, and Dad dug out some coral out of his heel that had been in there for a while.
He'd been snorkeling for pastime down there.
What a cute guy he was. And we took him on a tour. He wasn't even a Mormon. Isn't. And he was real curious. Here he had been among all the Mormons and everything, so we were really having a ball. Yeah. And he was just like ours. And then he left in a couple of weeks to go home, but we got to see him.
And his name is Chris Sandoval, and we took him to the mission office at night and showed him, and we showed him the picture of all the presidents, the temple, and he said, oh, I want one of those for my grandmother. He says, I want one. He wanted one of those. And then I says to him, I says, tell you what, I said, we'll try to get one. And I said, can you do the same kind of a job on a house like you've done on the temple? And he says, oh, sure. And I says, well, we got a house we've never been happy with. It was this block, you know. They sold us a deal of goods for that. They said it was better than brick when we built, so we used it, but we never liked it. So Chris did the outside of our house when he came home. He says, I only live about 2 miles from you folks. And he says, let me know if you want that job done. So he came over and did the house, and
So
did-
our house looks like this Samoan temple.
it's just exactly the same,
Same
as Samoan temple.
finish.
It's called our wall. It's got styrofoam that thick, and it's got mesh.
We had new
Coating.
windows put in, and we had him come and do that, and it's so quiet that we don't hear the sirens when they go off across the street.
We can't hear the kids
can't
at school.
hear the kids.
used
We
to
don't hear the
buses
buses.
and the trucks.
We'll look out and we'll say, gee, it's sure quiet. And there's all kinds of excitement. One day there were 3 fire department trucks out with their lights and their sirens. I hadn't heard a thing. I don't know why I looked out, but here was all that commotion and I hadn't heard a sound.
What do you remember about him? What was he like as a child?
Okay. As Lon, the first boy, was born in April 1946. And of course he was, I doted on him quite a bit. Like Dorene says, they wanted me to name one of the girls Jean so that to have a namesake. But I was quite close with Lon, and we had him out the first year he could walk, and coming in the snow, he was trying to follow in my footsteps, you know. And Mom says, what was it about his foot, Mom? I forgot it now. It went from my mind.
Well, you were telling him, now stay in the path.
Yeah,
Don't get over
stay
there in
in
the
the path.
snow. And he put his hands on his hips. And he says, make up your mind.
Yeah, he was only about two
Two.
years old, and he says, make up your mind. And then he was always saying, Daddy's this or Daddy's that, you know. And Mom says, oh, Daddy, my foot. He says, no, Daddy's soot.
Oh,
And he couldn't say water. What did he say instead of water?
Gurgle, gurgle. The kids all talk quite plain, though. They didn't talk with a kid accent. They talked like grown-ups more. But Les was always his mama's boy. Lon was my boy, and Les was his mama's boy. And we got Les a tricycle, and he was always crazy about cars. From the time he was 3 years old, he could almost tell you the different kind of cars. And
he's still good at that.
we had a tricycle, and you can look at our door frames around here. You'll see where the tricycles run into them and skinned them off. And I says to Mom, I'm not going to change that. I'm just going to leave it like it is. We painted over it, you know. And we used to have a door through there, and they'd make a circle, and on every one of those doors, he'd scratched up the door frames. But Les is, even to this day, he's quite his mama's boy. But he's learned to come to me now. He learns to kind of, Les and I are getting to be buddies, and here he is. He's nearly 50 years old now. See,
Yeah.
but I'm proud of Les. Whenever I want to know anything about a car or what to do and when and how to do it, and for years he's always put the tires on for me. He's been a service manager, you know, and he's put such good tires on my car. Of course, I pay for them, but the car I just got rid of, I never had a flat tire on it, and I had it for 6 years and never had a flat. And Les confides with me a lot now, much more than he used to, and that's good. And then Guy, he was my boy. Guy was really my boy. He would stay with me when I'd be up lots of times building our home while I'd step late and work on this or that or the other. And Guy would stay with me when he was even 5 and 6 years old. He didn't want to go to bed. He'd go to sleep on his feet, and he'd start to stagger around half asleep, you know, and I'd say, go on, get into bed now. He'd say, wake up, and he said, no, I'm going to stay with you. And he did. He always did. And he's kind of been that way till this day. He feels closer to me, though he drifted about as far apart or further than any of the boys have from me in a way, yet he's close to me, and we're closer now than we ever were. And he is coming around to everything is understood more between us, you know. And Guy was really a very honest boy. If he'd go play with his neighbors, friends and that, he'd always come to me without me even asking him. And he'd say, Dad, I'd like to go over to Daryl's, okay? Be home, say, in an hour or 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, and he'd come home right on time. And he'd always come to me. None of the others ever did it. He's the third boy. And Gary, was a nice kid. He was a real good guy. Gary and Bob came a year apart. They were close. And I think that me devoting a lot of time with Guy, that Gary never got quite as close to me as what Guy had. But Gary was always a good boy. He was upstanding in every way, and
Very lovable.
very fine individual. And then Bob came along, and he formed a trio. They were a year apart. Guy, Gary, and Bob, a year apart. And when we got down to, you notice the names that Mark had, like Mark Charles and Gary Ostler, and those Ostlers and Charles and that were family names. And other names like Lon and Leslie, they were my family names, you know. Grandma Mitchell says one day, well, you can get some other names, can't you, than the Sadler name? So we started naming them Ostler names. Then we got to Bob, and we couldn't think of a family name for him, so we tell him we got his out of a phone book, and he don't like us for that. He thinks we really let him down, you know. But we picked one that sounded good to us, and we called him Robert Lynn. And so then comes Mark, Kay, and Don, and Mark and Kay and Don. Mark got a Charles. He got back in the Ostler name. That was Dorene's grandfather she was talking about. At Kay, we just got his name out of, wasn't the directory, it was a school.
Was named after the doctor.
Oh yeah, he was named after the doctor I worked with, Kay Richard. The doctor's name, his wife's name was Kay, and his was Richard. And he asked us, he delivered 5 of our kids, the last 5. So he says, you got to name one after me. So we called Kay Richard after him and his wife. And then Don Russell.
We just liked it.
Huh?
Like Bob, we just liked the name.
Yeah, we like that. So that's the way the boys were. They've always all been wonderful kids. Some of them got inactive and got doing their own thing, but they're all coming back and telling us how wonderful we are and what
Name
a
the
wonderful
ones that went on
philosophy.
missions, Dad, and where they went.
Yeah, the 5, the oldest.
Where
5.
did Lon go?
Lon went to Washington.
Then Gary.
Lon to Washington, and Gary to Southern California, and Mark to Washington, and Don to California, and Kay to Japan, to Hokkaido, Japan.
Okay, we've got just a few minutes, Grandma.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Grandma, we're gonna get the pictures in there.
I know. I'm just trying to think. Let me go to the last 2 girls because
Okay,
you can
sure.
use that other.
Okay.
Let's see. Annette, of course, she was such a beautiful shock. I mean, there was a big party the night she was born here at the house, I'm told, and Judy and Barbara sure did have fun when they got their little baby sister. And that's the year they both decided to get married. Judy and Barbara left us. We never had 12 around the table. They left us and took their help and left us after, and also Grandma died Grandma Sadler died about that same time, just before Grant was born. And so we had kind of a big move there. But during the time that Annette was an infant, the whole family enjoyed her so much. And she had so many babysitters that it was ridiculous. And she was just like a little star in our house. And we very soon discovered that she needed a baby sister. So it wasn't too long, and we did get Lorie, and it was another miracle, just unbelievable. And so the 2 of them were never anything but just close. They had to be with all those big brothers. They had to be, and they were really close. They still are close today. They can't stand it when they have to go very long. You know, Lorie's so far away right now in Iowa, and every once in a while there has to be a phone call.
Yeah.
And we hear about it. And I'm close to those 2 girls right now, too. They've needed me with their problems and everything. And it's been so fun to see our little twins grow up this last year
And
over at
Annette had
Annette's.
the twins.
Annette had the twins this year. It's been a great year
A
for
boy
us.
and a girl,
Yeah. Cody and Tippy.
Cody and Tiffany.
All the cute things they do. He reaches over and deliberately pulls her hair till she hollers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other day when I was over there, she said, she was standing there alone and he wasn't in the room, and I called softly, Cody, where's Cody? And she looked everywhere, just like And then I did it again. Cody, and she looked again. I says, Annette, look how smart she is. She's not even a year old, and she knows what we're saying.
Yeah.
And then when he did come and show up, she just gets so exuberant and just so excited, and they're so cute together. Oh, and then Lisa's twins, I haven't seen much, but they're just as cute, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Tiffany and Tyler,
Mm-hmm.
I bet they're growing.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. Oh, it's so exciting.
Yeah.
Well, that's our children.
Yeah.
Judy and Barbara, Lon and Les, Guy and Gary, Bob and Mark, Kay and Don, Annette and Lorie.
How many grandkids do you have?
41, and the 42nd one is on its way. Les and Sally are
Les
going to
and
have a
Sally.
baby.
Yeah, Les just got married,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to have a baby.
Mm-hmm.
Big family, huh?
Yeah, it's exciting. And how many great-grands, Holly?